The Lord of Power. Episode 5 might be, hear me out, the best episode yet. Make of that what you will, as well as the most controversial. But whatever your feelings may be, let them out down below. I want to talk about what I think is the strongest element of this episode before I get to those controversial parts. The Harfoot storyline opens with Nori and the stranger bonding, and honestly, it's a sweet relationship. It's nice seeing characters talk and relate and have a chance to develop, something that this episode seemed to do a lot more and the series as a whole has needed for a long time. That is a good thing. But the highlight of this episode for me was the wandering song scene. I've talked before about the lack of poetry in the series, and I don't just mean like songs and music. I mean the Harfoot's chant about nobody going alone, and the sea is always right line in Numenor, plus a lot of clunky dialogue that feels overly modern, it just doesn't fit. You know, there's a poetry to Tolkien's work that the show has missed the mark on a lot of times, and the best moments in Rings of Power have had that poetry to them, you know. But this song and the scene with it in this episode, I think actually worked pretty well. Absolute credit to Bear McCreary, the composer, who time and again proves that he has created some of the best stuff in Rings of Power. And I actually want to read you, or should I sing? Oh, this is a bad idea, but you know what, I'll sing. I'm gonna sing you part of the song, right? The sun is fast falling beneath trees of stone. The light in the tower no longer my home. Past eyes a pale fire, black sand for my bed. I trade all I've known for the unknown ahead. Call to me, lands far away. For now I must wander this wandering day. Forgive the singing, but the structure and cadence to the song is actually very Tolkienian. It even has a nice little reference at the end where they say, you know, not all those who wander and wander are lost, which is a reference to a very famous Tolkien poem. Thematically, the song also keys into all of Tolkien's ideas, and all I could think while watching this was, why wasn't this scene or something like it in the opening episode? It tells us about the Harfoot migration, it tells us what kind of people they are, or at least the kind of people I think the writers want them to be. It helps sets the tone. There's this beautiful montage of them, you know, helping each other and living together, which could have been a great introduction, and personally, you know, it helped me feel more immersed in the world. I talked about this kind of scene, you know, before with the Deezer scene from the last episode. There's something enchanting to them. If they spent more time on the relationship between Nori and the stranger and the family, like they did in this episode, and less time on the hobbits will leave behind their weak and injured that they've done in the past, I think that this Harfoot storyline would move me a lot more. It was nice to focus on that relationship. She helps him, he helps her. And yeah, I gotta say again, you know, I'm not a fan of the hobbits leaving behind their weak and injured storyline. Personally, I don't think it fits. In this episode, you know, we have someone saying that they should literally take their wheels so that they cannot follow them, which is pretty horrific, you know? But what I'm struggling with, even though I know that it's probably just me not liking this decision for the lore, you know, is why they made this as a writing decision. Because, you know, if they needed to separate these characters from the pack, or they needed a reason for the stranger to help this family, help Nori, then there are other ways to do that. All this seems to do is make me dislike characters that I think the writers want me to like. And that's one way that we can kind of measure writing, you know, did the writer achieve the things that they set out to do? Especially because in this episode we see that the stranger has these people, these cultists or something following him, and that could provide plenty of tension on its own. And a migration is a perilous thing. Nori talks about it. Those environmental dangers could also provide, you know, tension. The stranger in this episode, though, saves the Harfoots from some wolves in what distinctly looked to me like Gandalf's fog of war blast from Fellowship, but he injures himself in doing so. If he is an Astari, and I have kind of come around to the idea that he might be one of the wizards, then this is him, you know, learning how to be in mortal form. The limits of that physical body. But yeah, the Harfoots of this episode do end with these weird cultists finding the Meteor Man's crater and presumably following him. They definitely have evil music cues, but they could be other wizards for all I know. But again, I was watching this scene and feeling like this was an episode 1 or 2 story beat happening in episode 5. Why didn't this happen earlier, you know? One thing Rings of Power has struggled with a bit is kind of momentum and direction, about drive, it's about power.
We stay hungry, we devour.
To be fair, Tolkien's stories are typically slow, but they don't usually feel like just a chain of events that happen after one another. And I think bringing this in as a point of tension earlier on would have really helped with that sense of direction. But what about Numenor and Galadriel? I've criticized before how the conflict on Numenor feels kind of simplistic. There's a lot of telling rather than showing, and they haven't managed to communicate the tension on the island very effectively. It feels quite shallow for the most part, This is largely because we haven't really had many scenes with Ar-Pharazôn up until this point, and the scenes that we have had have felt, honestly, quite cartoonish. But we finally do get some scenes with Ar-Pharazôn that kind of flesh him out and the conflict, and that is a good thing. But again, it's like, these scenes should have been in the earlier episodes when we're establishing the conflict. And this is the same with Halbrand and Elendil and Isildur this episode. We get some scenes which help develop them as people, their relationships, their conflicts, and that's good. But again, we should have had these scenes earlier on in the series. It's part of why the series has felt quite shallow and meandering. This isn't just episode 5, this is 3 episodes from the end of the season, and it feels like the whole first half of the season has been pretty bloated and crammed so that none of it really gets to breathe. While it's good that we're getting some depth to these characters, it's almost too little too late, and I still haven't fully bought into the Numenor and Galadriel storyline personally. I don't know how you feel, but I'm not quite psychologically engaged with the tension, really feeling it yet. I do want to mention the song about Numenor that was in this episode. I thought that was a nice touch. I really liked that. It was good to see a little bit of their culture, As a side note, my partner, Laura, I think she's a pretty good barometer for what most casual viewers of these kinds of stories often think. She hasn't read the books, doesn't know the lore, likes fantasy, but prefers, modern dramas and comedies. And so I like asking her questions about her perception of the series without my very, very distorted glasses of viewing, the stuff. And I was like, what do you think of Galadriel? And she said that she found her really, really annoying. And that's really interesting for me because I don't think the writers intend that. I think they wanted us to get behind her fury, her anger, and really understand that. And I'm not sure they've achieved what they set out to do there. But maybe she's wrong. Do you buy into that? One note on the lore, in the books, Numenor already has a colonial empire, a bunch of port cities along Middle-earth's coast. It doesn't seem like they have that yet, and I think that they're going to have that whole story play out with Ar-Pharazôn, setting up these port cities and getting trade and sort of becoming colonial oppressors. We'll see how that plays out. I did find it strange that they made a big deal last episode about Numenor going to war, and it's like 3 ships, it's like 500 men. I was like, that it? It makes Numenor feels pretty small. The dialogue to me still has these clunky scenes, like Galadriel's teaching the Numenorians to fight, and she says, "Come at me," which is, given the way that we use that term nowadays, is a very weird choice for your dialogue. And while the scene between her and Halbrand, about why she's fighting, it's good, it had a good start, it was filmed quite interestingly, I felt it was a little bit stunted when all it ended with was, because I cannot stop. That didn't really feel like a revelation. It didn't feel like there was a lot of growth there necessarily. When I think that at episode 5, at the point that we're in the story, they really need to go deeper than this. And when she's teaching them, she says, I'm going to tell you how to kill an orc. You stab them, which is just a very meh moment. I don't know. There's a lot of moments like that where, the story just goes, that's, flat where it shouldn't have been. Oddly though, I think the storyline that actually worked for me least in this episode was the Southlands, okay? So there's this problem, again, of the conflict feeling a little bit shallow or inconsistent. Like, Bronwyn at the start of the episode rallies everyone to fight and seems really behind it. And then at the midway point, she just has a total heel turn out of nowhere saying that they should surrender. While I like Arondir, I don't feel like I know Theo or Bronwyn that well, or the community more broadly. I kept wondering, why don't they just leave? They don't seem to really want to fight. They are clearly out of food. Arondir must know a way across the mountains. It's just odd. Half the town just upping to go and surrender felt to me pretty kind of sudden and forced. I've talked about a lack of subtext before. kind of came out there. The story is converging on Numenor saving the Southlands, but personally, I'm just not invested enough yet in Numenor's conflict, nor in saving the Southlands, that for me, the arc of this first season falls a little bit flat. And the frustrating thing is that none of this is the worst storytelling in the world. People are being really hyperbolic about that. It's just underwhelming. I'm not feeling the investment and tension that I think the writers are writing as if they have earned. I don't know how you feel. I don't know how the audience as a whole feels. This is just my experience, and I'm very curious to see how that matches up more broadly. Let's talk about the most controversial moment of the episode, Durin and Elrond, which is interesting because, of course, that's been the strongest storyline in the series so far. In this episode, we learn that Gil-galad thinks Mithril contains the light of the lost Silmarils, and the Eldar are dying, so they need Mithril to bask in the light of the Valar once more and survive, okay? To be clear, this is not in the lore, this is not in the books. The Silmarils were these magical gemstones that contained the light of the trees that you saw at the start of the series. There was this whole war fought over them. One was sent up into the stars, one was sent into the ocean, one was tossed into a volcano. Not a mountain like Khazad-dûm. It is the light, by the way, it's the light in the vial that Galadriel gives to Frodo in The Fellowship of the Ring. Thematically, the loss of the Silmarils and the fading of the Eldar, the elves, is very important to Tolkien's work, so potentially altering it like this is a very bad adaptation decision. Of course, if this does turn out to be true, then yeah, I hate this. I really don't like this idea at all. In fact, I don't even like that they introduced the idea in the first place, even in theory. It also has a lot of really weird lore implications if it's true. Now, Elrond does say that this is a myth, it's apocrypha. There is a chance that this is all a lie, that it's being done by Sauron in the background, that the elves are being tricked, which would be good. If that is the direction they go, I'm on board, sure, whatever, okay? But even so, saying, this isn't in the books is not a critique, even if I totally understand why it affects your enjoyment in the series, as it does mine. See, there are lots of stories that massively change the source material, and they are excellent, they're classics. Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep is vastly different to its film adaptation, Blade Runner, which has gone down in history. For me personally, if this doesn't turn out to be a lie, then this will pretty firmly shift Rings of Power into this is a very bad adaptation territory, especially because, if Amazon wanted to create their own lore and magical fantasy world, they could have done that. Why attach the name Middle-earth to it? Oh, I know, money. But also, kind of like with the hobbits leaving behind their wounded and injured, I have to ask, why go with this thread of tension? Tolkien already says this is the time the elves come closest to falling to evil and magic and machinery. Sauron is manipulating them. The elvish realms are beginning to die. That's why they forge the rings. Sauron is returning. That's a lot to play with. This, on the other hand, feels like an oddly convenient and contrived way of forcing characters into conflicts that aren't as personal, aren't as interesting, that aren't really that necessary for what we've got. We don't know where they're going to go with this. I'm going to withhold judgment, wait and see, but how do you feel about it? As usual though, the friendship between Elrond and Durin is really solid, it's sweet, it's fun, it's warm. Burden shared can be either halved or doubled is a nice little clever line. We get this great character moment, where Elrond refuses to break his oath to Durin, though there is good reason to think that Elrond might be forced to break his oath in the lore. I really like the oath, this relationship, and this point of tension between him and the elves and his place amongst them. Though, I will mention, at the end of the episode, Elrond comes to Durin and he says, he's trying to tell him that, Gil-galad knew about the Mithril and that's why he sent him there in the first place. And he phrases it in the most conflict-creating way he possibly could. He basically said, I did lie, I came for the Mithril. And I'm like, why did you explain it like that? You didn't have to explain it like that. When he didn't lie, and he's usually very careful with his words. So, hopefully you can see how this is simultaneously potentially the strongest episode in the series, and also the most controversial, and maybe too little too late. We actually have this Discord with all of the Tolkien YouTubers, and the general consensus seems to be after this episode, well, screw the lore, I guess, but hey, at least we finally have some characters on screen. Fundamentally, this whole season in the end seems to be kind of set up, right? Even the conflict at the end in the Southlands is pretty small. they're playing the long game, and we're gonna have to see how that turns out. At the moment, for me personally, I haven't quite bought into the narrative and tension that they're really relying on, so overall, a little bit flat, but how do you feel about it? And if you do like it, that's 100% okay. You know what? A-okay. Totally cool. You enjoy what you want. No problem with that. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.